Well, thank you for joining, and thanks everybody for listening in. Um, we're here today to talk service excellence and tips and tricks for how to achieve it. So, what does it mean? How do we get there? And there are a number of questions and topics along the way. And I couldn't think of anybody better to help us discuss those topics than Todd. If you're not familiar with Todd Kane, you will be very shortly, but you should be. Todd, why don't you intro yourself?
Sure. So Todd Kane, I run a company called Evolved Management Consulting and focusing on helping MSPs be more profitable with less stress. So do you want me to give the sort of the 2 minute background or just leave it at that?
2 minute background would be great.
Sure. So I was a neighborhood nerd who ended up having a consulting company before I graduated high school, and then got rolled up into a very large, well, small at the time, but went through this explosive growth phase for this IT company. It was when oil and gas was popping. I grew up in Calgary, which is sort of the Texas of Canada, and oil was $200 a barrel, and VMware was a brand new thing. So there was just money in the streets, and consultants were having a heyday. So we
Wild
went
West.
through this pure, yeah, Wild West, the IT Wild West. So we went through this period where we were hiring 20 to 30 people a week for a sustained period. So this insane growth forced us to scale management, and that pulled me from the technical side into the operations side, and found I really loved it. It was people puzzles rather than systems puzzles, which I'd worked on all my life, and got really into it. So that was my introduction to operations. Went and did a couple of turnarounds for some other consulting organizations and telcos in Canada, and then ended up at an organization called Fully Managed, which is a fairly well recognized MSP in the industry, which is also the birthplace of IT Glue. So kind of repeat situation, basically post merger hangover between two companies, getting smashed together, and then we scaled the business, tripled revenue, doubled headcount, increased gross margin by double digits, and cut turnover by double digits as well. So kind of reflected on this and realized a lot of the things that I'd been doing in these sort of my adventures as a entrepreneur, COO, effectively. A lot of it was repeatable. There was no secret sauce to it. So I wanted to kind of take this bag of tricks and toolbox that I had and bring that back to my consulting roots and consult on a one-to-many basis in the channel as I'm doing now. So that's me.
Love it. Yeah, if you can deliver anywhere close to those results for folks, pay for yourself and then some.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been fun too.
Definitely. And so quick intro to myself. Matt Linn, co-founder and COO of Thread. In a prior life, I spent 10 years with an MSP by the name of RFA in New York. They focus on hedge funds and private equity companies, starting compliance, grew through account management, and then ultimately ended up in ops myself. And so probably the last 8 years of my time there, overseeing, administering the PSA administration team was one aspect of it, but very, very fully ingrained in all aspects of the MSP's operations. And so ultimately became chief of staff before we decided to give Thread a go. And I think that's the theme, right, of the our chat today is operational excellence, service excellence. What does it look like within the context of a service provider? If and as you're on the path to achieving it, what does that impact mean for your bottom line, and how to think about where to start is how I frame the conversation. Where would you like to start?
Well, I think maybe just that like think about this as a bit of a journey and a maturity journey. So what are some of the fundamentals that you need to get in place in order to start from wherever you are, right? Like when I'm working with an organization, I'll usually frame it as where are you, where do you want to be, and what's the game plan to sort of move you through that continuum, right? And I think everyone kind of has to recognize that one of my sort of favorite expressions about the MSP industry is everyone kind of has the same business model and no one operates the same way. And everyone's kind of at a different place along that maturity continuum. So you need to kind of recognize where you're at and understand what are the things that you could do better? What are the areas that cause friction for your clients, for your staff, for you as a manager or an owner? And are there sort of tools, systems, and processes that could really help you to develop and step forward? It's kind of always continuing to step forward. There's no specific thing, I think, that will massively move the needle for you. There's a bunch of things that sort of like progress you forward and kind of solve some of the problems that you are faced that are pretty common probably in the industry, and have some points of reference. But there's no sort of solution or secret to this. It is just a journey to kind of figure out the things that cause a lot of problems or cause a lot of friction in your company, and how do you go about improving those at the very least, and hopefully kind of solving them and then moving on to the next thing. I think like starting with this conversation, the most important place that you have to fix first is service, right? Because in an MSP, it's the widest sort of visible surface as a partner for all the things that you do as an IT organization. The bare expectation is that you can provide good service and you have a good help desk and your staff are responsive and able to solve the problems for the users. That's table stakes, right? Like, why are you in the room? Why are you a partner if those are the things you can't do? So if service isn't stable, one, it really degrades trust with the partner, but also it's a bit like a black hole. It just constantly sucks you back in if it's not working properly. So you can't go and focus on the other parts of the business because, how are you going to have conversations with clients and do TBRs, sell projects, if all they want to talk about are the tickets that they opened last week that no one has returned a call or given them an update on? So service is so fundamental in that aspect and has to be fixed because everything else is kind of useless unless it's working properly, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? And we believe in the experiential angle on service, but really, there are many facets to it, and it could be it's inefficient, right? Or they're waiting for a callback, they don't get it, or to your point, they don't even respond to a request. Your team, and so it sounds to me like you start with taking a really honest look at that aspect of the business first and saying like, is this acceptable? Is it not? And that's starting from that point of view as a foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think some of the big things are priority management, I think are really important. So people can kind of overcomplicate this, right? Like what is my response time on a P1 versus a P3 versus a P4? And they make it sort of more complicated than it needs to be out of the gate. There are some good industry benchmarks that you can kind of start with as reference points. And the one thing that I'll say, like when people want to use KPIs, like I use KPIs for everything. Like I'm a dashboard junkie. Like there's as much reporting and data as I can get my hands on. I love it. I'm sure you're probably the same, Matt. Like just give
Oh
me the
yeah,
data. What does the data say, right? But the
100%.
yeah,
Are there any like resources or like specific publications that you might recommend folks look into for benchmarks?
there's not the only place that has a good sort of localization of this information is service leadership, but it's a paid service in order to be a member of that service, and you have to do a bunch of things with your business to conform to their standards, and then you get benchmarked in there.
Mm-hmm.
Some peer groups have some benchmarking. I've got some blog posts on my website that talk about some of the KPIs that are useful. But one of the things that I sort of caution people around is that benchmarks and KPIs are a reference of what's possible, not necessarily what should be. And that's one thing that people sort of like maybe sort of get wrong when they try to go about this is they think, oh, well, our SLA should be this. Our EBITDA should be this, our margins should be this, our pricing should be this. And that's not necessarily what it says. It says this is what others are doing. So here's sort of a band of reference of what you could do. So the important part is figuring out where are you first and in reference to those KPIs, right? So for example, like SLAs, usually 34 and 8 is a good sort of reference number, and that's 30 minutes for response, 4 hours for resolution plan, and 8 hours for resolution. It's kind of like this general industry benchmark. Now, if that's the standard that you're running at, okay, right? It's what you can sort of set an expectation for contractual obligations for. But I can tell you,
Hmm.
if you're taking 8 hours on average to resolve a ticket, it's probably too long, right? There's some complications to that about some of that PSAs will register either SLA bound time or elapsed time. We're kind of getting into the weeds here right away. But like how long a ticket is open is not necessarily what is bound to the SLA. It's how long you're working on that ticket. And then
Hmm.
probably the most important part in managing the tickets through that life cycle and against an SLA is communication. So the higher cadence you communicate with the client, the more likely they are to trust the process and get off your back. But if they submit a ticket and don't hear about it for 2 days, people are going to be angry. People hate sort of not knowing. And I think that's probably one of the most important places to start is look at your process around communication and how you're aligning against that SLA, and setting and resetting expectations is probably a really excellent place to start. Would you agree, Matt?
Yeah, definitely. Like every time that we lost a customer at RFA and with other partners that I've worked with, it largely wasn't the quality of like the service delivered, or we didn't have the best CCIEs around, we didn't have the best sysadmins around. Like no, super talented. Where we would fall short most often is the communication element, which again it sounds obvious, but it's super important. If you're not setting that expectation on like a heartbeat until the problem's resolved and it's resolved satisfactorily, then you're bound for trouble.
Yeah.
Are there any like strategies or workflows or automation that you might recommend that would help to do so, or is it purely I have a clock running in my head, or my time entry clock's been running for 30 minutes, I have to give an update?
Yeah, it's tricky. The one thing I do sort of like warn against, what is really common is people build PSA workflows where like it triggers on a particular event and tries to email this person. And this is bad for a number of reasons. One, like you don't want to keep pulling people back into email. Like this, the distraction monster of other tools in your environment are things that you want to eliminate, not use as sort of like areas to try and like basically keyboard manage people, right? So like you're not talking to anyone, you're just trying to automate all of these things and get people to do what they're supposed to do. Management
Hmm.
doesn't work that way. Like I'm sorry to break it to people, like you can't just make people automatons and do the workflows that are designed for them. I'll slip slightly into a rant about this because it's really bothering me lately. Is the number of times that people ask for a process, like do you have a process? Can you give me a process that does X? So, and what is inherently always the subtext of this is my team doesn't do this right. If I had the best process in the world, then they would be better. And that isn't just not true, right? Like process does not create better outcomes and it doesn't change how people behave. Human interaction, accountability loops, these social connections, people management, those are the things that change how people operate and the behaviors that they conform to. So I'd say that is sort of the biggest piece is don't try to make this automated. It's a human piece of, and it's largely behavioral based. And those are the things you need to start to change and adapt is behaviors, expectations, um, an alignment around those things. So if it's not, setting up workflows and emailing people, then what is it? It's not IMing them in Teams. It's not trying to, again, kind of hide behind this keyboard. It is human interaction. So first and foremost, in a lot of these cases is sure, have a process, but a process that people don't adhere to is useless. So they have to be trained on it. So if you can build a process and train people and set an expectation of this is what we do around here. That's how you build culture, like a performance service-based culture is these are the expectations. And when people are not meeting those expectations, then you need to give them some feedback on this is how we do things around here. And so how you're actually managing this is both real time as well as sort of after action. And the real time kind of looks like the management or the team lead kind of monitoring what people are working on through the course of the day. And a good way I like to do this again is this is where KPIs can be really helpful is you can basically look at so a system that we set up at FM was monitoring number of tickets completed, and each pod had basically 3 TVs. So we're hanging above the group, right? And you could see from every angle sort of all of their KPIs in real time. We use BrightGauge for this, hung over their stations. So literally you can walk around and see how everyone's performing through the course of the day. And what this is helpful for is if the expectation is to close, say, 10 to 15 tickets per day, if it's noon or 1 p.m. and they've only closed two tickets, that's problematic, right? So you would sort of dip in and be like, hey, Chris, it looks like you're struggling. Are you stuck on something? What's up, right? And it's never like hey, get your crap together and do better. It's like, hey, I'm curious. I want to understand what's going on here. How can I help you? Right. So you're coming in a very supportive fashion to kind of direct people in real time and give them that feedback and course correct. Because if you get to the end of the day and realize they only closed 3 tickets, they're supposed to close 15, you've already lost the day. There's nothing that you can do. Right. So you have to be able to do this in real time. And if you're finding that there's a resistance or just sort of a lack of capability for people to execute on this on a real time basis, then you need to sort of meet with them and be like, hey, what doesn't work? Like, are there processes that we have that just don't make sense? There's systems that you have to use. It takes you a ton of time. What are the problems, right? Like I describe this as putting on your managerial detective hat and try and figure out like, what's wrong here, right? Is it a people problem? Is it a process problem? Is it a technology problem? Last aspect of this, sorry, I'm ranting. A last aspect to this is like the tools don't necessarily fix these problems either, right? And that's the other aspect of this is having a better PSA, having more automations in your RMM. These are not the things that will necessarily save you here. Like this is in a lot of cases, most of the work that we do is human labor effort, right? There are certainly automations that you can build to make things maybe more efficient or take less time, but that's not the magic sauce of how you make an MSP more efficient. It's about how you're getting people to affect the work and manage the work in real time. That's largely sort of like getting people to understand how we do things around here in an efficient and effective way, and making sure that they're well supported and they have what they need to be successful. That's, I think, the biggest piece of that. Anything you would add there, Matt, on my glorious rant?
No, I mean, I think you're spot on, right? Like, you want to start from being able to make sure that you can capture all of the data and the KPIs that you need to establish whether or not you're meeting certain standards, right? So step one, be able to measure it. Step two, if you're not meeting those standards of service, you need to be able to again take an honest look at the company, the operation, process, and people, and really figure out, are we not directing people in the right way or giving them the support that they need, the training that they need to be able to hit these standards? And if we're not, fix that. Otherwise, it could be a process or people problem.
Yeah. And I guess just quickly, like as we're going here, if you guys have some questions, either unrelated to the things that we're talking about, probably hopefully in the vein of service, but we can go wide field if you need to, or if you need me to clarify anything, or you have some questions about what we're talking about, but feel free to kind of throw some things in chat and we can address that. So jump in if you like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what I'd like to do is continue to progress through the maturity journey, right? Is
Yep.
once you've picked those foundational items, what would you recommend doing?
Yeah, so a lot to work on in sort of that service field. We'll just sort of broadly call this like fixing help desk, right? From a service delivery standpoint. We can sort of circle back to this if we want to dig a little deeper, but I'll maybe sort of take it through the next steps of the maturity chain here. So what we're talking about here is what I have as a service pyramid, right? So the base layer of that service pyramid is service. And then the next layer up from that is projects, right? So project management, project delivery, kind of engineering team. There's sort of different names for this. And this is a really tricky spot for a lot of organizations. And why this is probably relevant to sort of this point of the conversation is service and project management have a lot of interplay, especially for kind of a growing MSP where they don't have dedicated project resources and they're sharing usually T3s and sometimes T2s. And this is incredibly frictionful in a lot of organizations because the tyranny of now, as I describe it, is like whatever the sort of the last thing in the inbox is what people will tend to work on. And that really becomes a massive distraction from the things that are important, but don't really have a lot of urgency to them. And that's usually where projects live. It's like this stuff needs to get done, but it can always wait till tomorrow, right? And then project timelines start slipping. You were like, oh, I'll do this tomorrow, and then tomorrow you get waylaid by some other escalation, right? So the noisier service is, the less likely you are to perform well on projects. And interestingly, like you noted, it's not necessarily the end product, the support that you provide. It's the communication that will cause client problems from a service perspective. More and more, what I've seen now is MSPs are losing clients because of failures on projects than they are service, right? Service is pretty good in a lot of organizations. It's been an area of focus for, the last 5 to 10 years in the industry. But projects is still, unfortunately, the sort of the forgotten realm of IT service delivery because, we just don't focus on it and don't apply sort of the right resources around this. So I would say that's the next best area to spend some time on. Quick little suggestion around ways that you can improve that in keeping with the tips and tricks here is if you're going to schedule someone to work on projects, book them in 2 or 4 hour time blocks in their calendar and defend that space for them. Tell the rest of the team that if you need escalations, if you need to talk to Greg about this because he's the T3 escalation point for the rest of the team, and he's also the projects person, that if you need to talk to him, you need to go through a team lead or the service manager first. And that person can kind of ask a bunch of questions, qualify the escalation, judge whether or not it's urgent enough to actually go interrupt Greg. That way, Greg can kind of turn off Teams, turn off email, and just like go deep and focus on the project. That way, he's way more likely to not feel bad when someone starts DMing him asking for his support because techs are naturally very helpful. Like they don't want to tell people no. And if you put them at the position of people constantly DMing them, they're going to drop what they're doing and go help somebody else instead because it's in their face and they don't want to be like, no, I can't help you with this. Figure it out yourself. I'm busy. Right? Like the crotchety ones may say that, but most people in the organization hopefully will not be that rude. And so you need to be able to give them that space to be able to focus on that. And that's how you can actually adhere to a project timeline and deliver kind of on time, on task, on budget. So that I think is a really big one is that 2 to 4 hour blocks and creating a block and tackle for them for escalations to give them that space to actually focus. One other one I would suggest is don't let techs manage their own projects. This is especially problematic in small MSPs because they're like, well, we don't have a PM. And I can tell you, like my favorite expression around accountability, because a lot of organizations ask me about accountability. It's probably the number one thing that I get asked about is how do I make my team accountable to this stuff, right? And that's sort of the wrong question, right? Accountability is inherently a social action, right? So if you leave someone in a vacuum, they're going to make a lot of justifications to themselves about the decisions that they have made or the decisions that they are going to make. And that doesn't make them a bad person. It's just simply human bias. Like it's a deep-seated human psychology. We all do this. We'll make justifications for the things that we decide or that we think are the right thing to do. both proactively and retroactively. So you need to have some external party to hold create an accountability loop for someone that's supposed to work on that project, right? Hey, you were supposed to get this done on Wednesday afternoon. Was that done? And they're like, no, I didn't. Right? They're going to feel bad about that and hopefully be able to reprioritize something. So who you have as a project manager can be the owner, could be a team lead, could be the service manager. It can even be like an office manager. I've seen some really, really talented and administrative people in an organization become or like grow into a project manager because like they were just good at admin. They were good
Hmm.
with people. They had some good task management capability, and they were structured. And they just sort of started doing this off the side of their desk. And as the company grew, they became the project manager. So that's another one that I think is really, really crucial in order to get projects right. So anything else there, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of great content there, and I think it also that third party accountability loop and having that mechanism to keep people honest and on track and on delivery schedule, in my experience, is super important as well. And I think that's a natural bridge or segue into an item that we've talked about a little bit, which is in my mind, that's the function of the dispatcher, right?
Mhm.
When it comes to service. Um, so that there is a bit of a debate, or at least there are different models, right? Of
Yep.
um, quick fix tech who triage a request as it comes in. They then spend a certain amount of time on it before passing it along, and that pod doesn't have a dispatcher, for example. Or if you have a more traditional service desk model where requests are coming in, however they come in, you have a dispatcher who's knows enough to triage and then assigns the tech and holds them accountable. I have a sense which way you're going to fall on that side of the debate, but curious to hear it directly.
Okay, so like at RFA, did you guys use dispatchers?
We did.
Okay. And was that like a single dispatcher for the larger team or dispatchers embedded inside pods?
So it was a series of dispatchers on shift for because we were 24/7 kind of follow on model. So we always had a dispatcher on shift, and really in our minds it was you know process versus experience. There's a
Mhm.
trade off there, right? And if you lean into the process very heavily, oftentimes you lose the experience element, which we believe to be very important. And so um, we leaned into the dispatcher model because we wanted to make sure that somebody was dedicated to closing all the loops, so to speak.
Right. Okay. So I would say like your model maybe aligns more to what I generally support is more of a service coordinator, right? So there's a lot of terms for this role, and it's definitely kind of a spectrum as to what they do and how they function in the team. To your question directly, I definitely run kind of counter to most of the industry in that I don't like dispatchers as a role in MSPs. Not to the extent where I would say if you have them, you're doing it wrong. I think like it usually comes about for the wrong reasons in an organization.
Mm-hmm.
I see dispatchers primarily as a crutch around administrative practices that they can't get the team to adhere to. Right. So instead of just getting the team to change their behavior to get on task and actually do the things that are required around ticket management, they layer in basically administrative support to do the things that they can't get the team to do. So that's usually how I find that the role sort of comes into existence in most MSPs, which is fundamentally kind of the wrong way to think about this, right? And there's a bunch of reasons as to why. Like obviously, the administrative role of a dispatcher, like unless you're 40 to 50 staff or more, dispatchers tend to not make a lot of sense, and because at that level there's enough transactional communication that they can really function as a service coordinator. So for example, where they can be helpful is where someone is working on through a queue of tickets and they're supposed to work on something, but they're working on sort of a sudden P2. It's not an emergency, but it's a higher priority item, and therefore they can't get to the ticket that is like a low priority priority ticket that was scheduled at 11 a.m. So rather than them spending kind of 10 or 15 minutes to chase down that user and update them and say, hey, I'm so sorry. I'm going to call you and tell you that I can't work on your ticket, even though I just called you. Can I work on that this afternoon instead, or tomorrow, for example? Like a service coordinator, just taking that on for the tech is really valuable, right? So they can call the user and say, hey, so sorry, we're working on some priority issues that are affecting multiple users. Is it okay if we push this to 1 p.m. instead of 11? And you can do this a couple of times as long as you're updating people around these changes to the tickets, and they won't get super frustrated. Whereas if you just don't call them at 11 and just call them tomorrow at 9 a.m., they're going to be mad, quite rightly. It's like I can't trust anything that you guys say to me, right? So this cadence of communication is where this can be helpful. The other piece is like if you have a dispatcher that is non-technical, there's really not a lot that they can do for the low-hanging fruit, like the really sort of quick wins, quick closes that you can have in an organization. So my feeling is you're much better off just having like a really general T1, right? So the way I design this for groups that I'm working with is it's a flat T1 triage team where there is a group of people that share the dispatch hat, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it is important as a function in the organization to make sure the things that you were talking about are happening, right? Like stuff is being structured, there's good management to the queue, people are being called back on voicemails. All of those things are important for the dispatcher to do. My feeling is it just doesn't have to be a person, right? If what we would do is have a dispatcher or two that were designated in the team, in that triage team. And they would
Mm-hmm.
rotate that hat on either a daily or a weekly basis, depending on various factors. And this was really helpful because one of the things that really bothers me about the dispatcher role is I have talked to numerous dispatchers that end up crying because they're so upset by how they're treated and disrespected by the rest of the team. They are just trying to help. And a function of that is they have to tell busy, smart, technical people what to do, and they have no role power to do so, right? It's a really unfair position to put what are usually sort of young female people
Right.
in these types of roles. Like it's it's a generalization, but it tends to be true. Like who are the dispatchers in MSPs? It's usually a young girl. It's really frustrating for them because they get snowed over by the techs, and sometimes they're rude about it. Sometimes they just sort of blow smoke and tell them a bunch of technical nonsense. And they're like, I don't know if it's true, but they told me something or other why they haven't been able to do this for the last 3 days, despite me asking. So I think it's a really unfair position to put them in. To ask them to try and direct techs about what their day is and how they do
Mm-hmm.
this. So it creates this like super resentful situation between these two parties, right? Whereas that
Yep.
service coordinator approach is very different, where they actually respect the role of having someone who can kind of support them, take a bit of that administrative burden off, but they should still be managing their own time and their tickets, right? So slide aside. So we've got this T1 triage group with a dispatcher designated within each of the teams. The reason why this
Mm-hmm.
is helpful is the person that's doing dispatch that day may be taking tickets the day after, and therefore they understand what's required and they're going to respect the requests of the dispatcher within that team. One, because usually they're somewhat technical and they know what they're talking about, they know what they're asking, and they know that a few days later they're going to be asking the same things of their peers as well. So it helps
Mm-hmm.
to kind of create this higher cadence of respect or communication within the team. And then people
So, so
often,
it's
yeah,
so
go
it
ahead.
sounds like, and this is interesting because I think there's a lot of merit to this, and I don't think that I've heard it very often. Which is, it sounds like they're being cross trained, right? They're maybe coming in more junior.
Yeah.
They're establishing themselves in the company. They're helping with the coordination and communication element, but that's just not going to get them to where they need to be most effective technically. And so it sounds like the recommendation there is to have a bit of a rotation amongst that tier one team.
Yeah, agreed. And to your point, like I think it's really, really important to hire on service capability, like people that are friendly, that have sort of a high EQ, emotional quotient, rather than technical skill. Because you can teach
Hmm.
people technical skill, but you can't teach people not to be an asshole, right? So it's so much better to hire a lot of tier ones, kind of train people up. They're the people that really excel at this will pick up some technical knowledge and hopefully scale up to a T2 eventually. And then you just backfill all the T1s, right? So that can be really, really helpful from a training and development of your staff is find great people that are willing to learn. And honestly, some of the best techs that I had in my organization came in as, practicum students, or in some cases, like they worked at a cell phone store and they didn't really know a lot about technology. They tinkered with stuff at home, so they kind of understood how to support desktop stuff, but they were keen, they were hungry, and they were willing to work for it. And then those people go a lot further than, trying to hire a 7-year experience T2 who's comes with a lot of ingrained bad habits and, stuff that you may have to train out of them. Sometimes they're a bit of a prima donna, all of those things. Like you get some great T1s that are just like clay and you can mold them into whatever you need to be. I think that that's a much better situation. Related to this, so Mike has a question here about pod methodology. Do you recommend
Hmm.
the pod methodology for support teams? If so, how do you recommend to move from a free for all group to a pod structure? So yes, I do recommend pods. Not for everybody, right? Like if you're, say, like a 10-person MSP, or even, sometimes up towards 20 MSP, like a T1, T2, and T3 group probably just makes more sense as a diffused group. Where this is where pods and dispatchers tend to come about is people have this idea of I want to have like certain expertise around a client, right? So like I want all of these techs to be able to work for this particular client and this particular client, but not this client over here. There's two problems with this. Is one, this is usually born out of client psychology, not what's best for the business, right? The sort of the key advantage of an MSP model is scalability, right? That we can sort of create a group of people that can work on a group of clients. The more you sort of silo that, you're going to end up with imbalances. Rebalancing pods in a small MSP is incredibly problematic, right? Like you're going to spend more time trying to figure out which clients go where, and it'll create the problems that you're trying to defend against. So a lot of people will say, well, the clients say that they just want to talk to Sarah whenever they call in. Like, can I talk to Mike? He's great, right? That's the wrong reason. The reason that they're asking for those particular people is that they're able to address the problem faster, or more likely, they do it in a very nice way, right? Like they feel like
Right.
they have a personal relationship with this person. It's more about the experience, right? To kind of your points about what you guys are trying to build, the experience matters a lot more than the end product. And what you need to look for is if people are asking for Sarah or Mike to do the work for them, what is it about that person that makes them excellent, and how can you have them help everybody else to be like that person and deliver
Hmm.
that same level of experience? What it doesn't do is provide a certain level of expertise. Sometimes this is true, right? If you have a very large MSP, like 70, 80 people, you're very likely to have pods. But I still recommend the best way to do this is not an integrated pod structure where it's T1, T2, T3 built into a single pod. You still do the T1 triage service desk style where everything flows in through the triage group. Then you escalate to a tier 2 group, which is a pod. So they have subject matter expertise, line of business expertise, right? Where that actually makes some sense. Like the only person that knows, Yardworks, like some LOB app, right? Or, everyone uses Quicken, but this group has zero. Like we don't know anything about this, right? Those points where you can escalate into a T2 group that has subject matter expertise, that sometimes makes sense. And then you actually break apart the T3 after that, because escalations to T3 are usually going to be technical in nature. They're not subject matter expertise, right? So flat tier 1, potted tier 2, flat tier 3 is usually how I would go about this. To the question about, how would you sort of make this change from a flat to a pod structure? Um, Usually the best way would be to run a bit of a trial with a group to figure out how you can sort of fold certain people into a pod. But again, like you need to understand why and how you're going to do this. You don't want to end up with the pod being absolutely waylaid by tickets from a bunch of noisy clients and everyone else sitting on their hands. So how do you balance this? And is it even necessary? So I would challenge the practicality of requiring a pod to begin with. And then you need to figure out, how are you going to be able to balance this? Because as I said, when you go to balance the pod, you may need to move clients from one pod to another. And then you're
Yep.
effectively creating what you thought you were defending against is, I only want to talk to Chris. Well, okay, now you're not in Chris's pod anymore. So that didn't solve that problem to begin with, right?
Right. Um, Super interesting. And I think what I'm hearing is uh, the recommendation is to go again. We fixed the foundational issues. We know where we need to be in terms of our KPIs, and if we're not there, what the path is to get there. Once we've gotten to that point, it sounds like the recommendation is, and if I heard you correctly, 50, 60, 70 people is around the level where you start to consider doing this. It's like you go from, I think of standardization versus specialization, and you go from a standardization approach, tier one triage, you get into a bit of specialization if and as it makes sense in tier two, and then again you get more. It's a higher level or degree of technical skill in tier three, but again it's more standardized approach to that level of problem solving.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Standardization is the strongest lever you can pull as an MSP. So whatever you can standardize, wherever you can standardize it is incredibly important. This is where process actually helps, right? If you standardize a process and try to get people, you train, retrain, and adapt that behavior so that it becomes sort of secondary knowledge, standardization and a process around that can be really, really helpful. The more you can standardize your client stack, that is gold for an MSP. Like it just makes support easier. It makes the environment more predictable, less prone to be noisy, all of those things. So that the standardization element of those things is really, really crucial. To expand on that point, I think around the subject matter expertise, like maybe you're building a vertical for a particular or building a pod for a particular vertical that you have, right? Like you have some investment houses and they use Bloomberg terminals or something like that, and
Mm-hmm.
that's specific subject matter expertise, and they probably require a certain level of higher support or maybe a higher sort of SLA commitment. Not to get too technical or too sort of like fragmented or detailed around this, but in a lot of cases, like this can be a selling solution or an offering that you could build, right? Like you can pay for having a dedicated pod, right? Like some of
Mm-hmm.
your clients will actually do that. So if they want to pay for this service, then maybe that's a reason that you could build it into sort of that verticalized pod where there's a necessity for subject matter expertise. You don't do this necessarily for the SLA alignment. It could be a benefit that you're kind of adding into the value offering. But generally, it's going to be around subject matter expertise. And then the standardization piece just applies everywhere, right? But maybe this creates more a bit of a bit of a playground or a bit of a test bed for heavier standardization and aligning some of those best practices. And then you can take that back to the rest of the team if you find that it really works, right?
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any advice or again tips or tricks for getting getting your customer base to the point of standardization? Is it something that's like weeded out in the sales engineering process when you're looking to onboard them? If they're not aligned to your standard stack, you don't even work to close them, or is it okay to move them over gradually over time?
Yeah, so this goes well into sort of the next tier of the standardized of the service pyramid. This was not intentional on yours or I behalf, but it worked out really well. So the next stage of after prod, so we've done service, we did projects, and now the next tier is account management. And this is where standardization becomes sort of a 10-mile march, I would say. It's not something you can just sort of wave a wand and everything magically aligns. That can be either difficult and or very expensive, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for example, like way back in the day, we I ran the largest Datto fleet at the time because we did this project we called Project Big Bang, where we had a lot of problems with our backup stack because we had I can't remember the backup software, but we had Dell as a hardware layer, whatever our software was, and then like another provider for the storage. And there was something else mixed in there. It was basically four providers that all of them would point at each other whenever there was a problem. And the guy that ran central services spent literally half his day just fighting with vendors to try and resolve issues. And we felt like this is an absolute waste of time. So we ripped out our entire backup infrastructure and standardized on Datto for the entire client base, and basically just ate most of the cost. Like we tried to sell this out to a lot of the clients through an account management practice that we were running QBRs, trying to sell them on this idea. But fundamentally, we were just going to replace them all, right? So that is a forced standardization that I don't necessarily recommend because it was very expensive. Worked out really well for us, but that's not typical. So
Yeah.
the process is generally still the same, though. I usually start this out for people on an account management matrix, like a standardization matrix, and you can build this fairly easily for yourself. I have a template for this, but functionally, all it is a list of all your clients down the left-hand side, and then a list of all of your offerings and or technical standards across the top. And then you just go through and create a heat map. So green, yellow, and red. Green are people that have that standard, and red are people that have kind of don't have it or don't consume that service. And that can be really, really helpful because then you can look at it on a client basis where like, whoa, there's a lot of red here. Like we need to meet with this client and try to help them through some TBRs to formalize on the other offerings that we have or change those technical standards. Or in a lot of cases, you can take it on a vertical, right? So like a couple of things that are totally like open, clear water for a lot of MSPs are you reselling their internet line, like their ISP? Like this is they're going to consume it anyway. Like you may as well resell it. And you often like certainly get a bit of cash, like 20 to 30% as a commission in a lot of cases. So that's great.
Hmm.
And also, you probably have more control in managing the support situation if you have a commercial grade leasing relationship or a partner model through the local ISP that you like. The other one is VoIP, right? So everyone needs phones in an office, right? So are you reselling their phone system to them? So those are a couple of things where you can do a vertical attack, where you go out and you
Hmm.
talk to every client about a particular offering that you're putting together. Um, Good example would be like Windows 11 changes coming up. A lot of people don't understand this, but most workstations that are like 2 to 3 years old won't work with Windows 11 because there's a TPM requirement. There's a functionality in the chips that is required with Windows 11 that won't work. So you can't upgrade these machines. So
Hmm.
you maybe go and propose to your clients, we're going to do a bulk buy. We're going to buy 2,000 workstations. If you want to get in on this, they're like $300 cheaper than typically what you would get because we're getting a great deal from the vendor, right? So there's different ways that you can kind of attack either the client level or the vertical around the technology or the standard that you're building. But fundamentally from there, it is that 100-mile march of we're going to go meet with all of these clients, get them on a roadmap, talk about standardization and sort of drag them down the road of aligning against those standards. This is a lot easier if you do this when you're selling initially to the client, but it's that you basically have to go back and resell to all of the existing clients that you have in order to force that standardization. How you do that in a net new prospect, there's a different ways that you can do this. I've seen some organizations where they do hardware as a service and like a full 3 year kind of commitment. So they'll go
Hmm.
in, nuke the entire environment and rebuild it over a weekend, right? And this is excellent, works super well, but good God, it's a lot of work. So not for everybody, not for the faint of heart. It's a ton of work and a huge amount of cost, but that's sort of the best case. The others are you would bring them on as a client, but you do basically their first roadmap with them as a part of that sales cycle, right? So this is
Hmm.
how you build that TBR cycle is you run them through this process and align them against those standards. And you say, these 6 things will not fly. Like we need to change these through projects in order to bring you on altogether, right? So like we can't start working with you until these standards are changed. And then step back from that is I'll bring you on as a client, but within the first 3 months, these 4 or 5 things have to change. Like you have to align to our standards. So there has to be some initial commitment to this, both from yes, we'll agree to those standards, and B, we'll commit the cash to actually do it. So those some of those
Hmm.
ways that you can kind of work with a prospect to enforce standardization, and some of the ways that you can kind of work with your existing client base to dig some of this up. And like this is an excellent process. I worked with a guy who runs a small MSP, and he went through this process of doing TBRs and pushing a standardization with his clients, and he dug up 35K in MRR, right? Like dramatically increased the profitability of his business, dug up a ton of projects to be able to work on, sold a ton of equipment, all for basically just going out and meeting with the existing client base. So there's a ton of opportunity here to bring standardization, make your lives a lot easier, but also make hay. There's a ton of money to be made here as well.
Yeah, definitely. And on both sides, I think, right? Like up front when you're executing the project work for this professional services element, maybe your managed services fee increases as well, or certainly over time. But there's also, taking it back to the service excellence framing on the other side of the equation. Your team is able to standardize how they address issues in that stack. The documentation is aligned. You're much more efficient to get to these answers, which ultimately means that you know the team has less time on ticket. They're able to resolve the issue faster and to a higher degree of satisfaction. In theory, making the gross margin of that account better on the other side as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like, there's if anyone's read the Phoenix Project, is an excellent book, and they have this character Brent, who is basically like the sort of the stereotypical T3 who knows everything about everything in the environment, and he is the bottleneck for basically everything in the organization, because like, oh, we don't know what to do with this, well, give it to Brent, and Brent is just like burning out trying to get all of this stuff done because it filters all through him. So you don't want to create Brent problems where like our standard is everyone uses Meraki, but there's one client with WatchGuard, and like only Brent knows about the WatchGuard. Like any
Right.
support issues that we have with that, like he's the only person who will save our bacon. Like one that's super inefficient. It's technically risky, right? Like what happens if you lose Brent? He wins the lottery and takes off. Or you don't want to sort of bring on additional clients with disparate infrastructure where you're like, oh, we're pretty good at this. We've got Brent for WatchGuard. Now we've got some Palo Altos. I don't know anything about Palo Altos. Like, what are we going to do here? Right. So like you get yourselves into these situations, you want to have standards. That, or like you take it on as a standard, then you need to have a really clear training path of people getting on board and being able to partner with that organization. Sort of actually, this gets to one thing that I see is problematic a lot of MSPs is training, right? The training paths and some standardization around that. The best way to build a training curriculum is figure out what are the requirements for all of your partner organizations. Just starting with Microsoft, like what are the tests that we need to write over the on a year-to-year basis? How about we proactively plan for that rather than, oh my God, we need to renew our
Interesting.
competency.
Yep.
Someone needs to go write a test next week, right? Like that's not fair. And so much of this can be done proactively. So, and it's helpful. Like if you can get the team to sort of work towards these things and build up skill sets around interesting technologies to be able to take on, great. You want to start doing maybe Azure desktops and no one really knows anything about that. Take a really keen tier two and have them sort of bury themselves for 3 hours a week in learning those things. And maybe in a couple of months, you'll be able to spin up some Azure desktops for people, right? Like there's an advantage to both the progression of the technology, but also giving people interesting stuff to work on and enforcing standardization, right?
Definitely. Definitely. I think both of us can talk about this stuff all day, right? But I think
Holy crap. Time blew by. It's
we're
9 already. Okay.
yep, we're up at the hour. If anybody has any follow-up questions, definitely able to go a little bit long. But please feel free to send them to us separately. We'll be sure to get back to you with that content. I think obviously we'll post the recording, but my wheels are turning in terms of knock-on content that we can share out. So definitely appreciate the time, Todd. And I think I found it a very valuable conversation that hopefully those who listened in did as well.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
See you, everybody.